Let the coffee hour begin. So I'm going to go ahead. I'm stopping my screen sharing right now, and I'm going to spotlight our guest of honor. Here she is. So thank you so much for joining us. How are you today, Holly?
Good, thanks. Hope
Good.
everybody is well, and thank everybody for joining.
The first thing that I wanted to ask you was just how you started out. How did you become an interpreter? And was it something that you always knew that you wanted to do, or did it come by surprise? Tell us a little bit about your beginnings.
Well, I was always interested in languages. My mother grew up partly in Europe because her father was a foreign correspondent for a newspaper in Chicago. And she spent a lot of time in Europe and knew languages back when she was a child, which I always thought was really cool. She didn't remember them, unfortunately. But it seemed to me like knowing another language was like a secret code. And I had 5 sisters, so I needed to keep secrets somehow. And that appealed to me, to know a code that nobody else knew. And there were kids that I went to school with whose parents spoke other languages, and the kids were embarrassed about it. They thought it was something shameful, and I was envious of them. So as soon as I got a chance, I started studying language. The options weren't very many. I started learning Spanish in 8th grade. This was in California. And then in high school, I started French. So I studied languages. I really liked them. I discovered that looking back at something from my high school, when they said in a survey, what do you think you'll be doing 30 years from now or something? And I had put translator ? At the time, I didn't know the difference between translating and interpreting. I loved languages, but I didn't want to teach the language, and I wasn't all that interested in literature per se, even though I really like to read. I really like just plain stories, not necessarily fine literature. So I majored in sociology as an undergraduate and continued taking French and Spanish. Then I had an opportunity when I graduated to go to graduate school in Monterey. At the time, it was the Monterey Institute of Foreign Studies, and they had a program in translating and interpreting. So I signed up, and that's where I learned the difference between translating and interpreting. And I realized that neither one of my languages was that good. So I dropped the French and focused on Spanish, which was more practical for living in California. And the first opportunity I got when I graduated was to interpret in legal proceedings. California had just passed a law allowing farm workers to organize unions, and they had Agricultural Labor Relations Board proceedings involving the farm workers. And it was really a trial by fire because the training that I got in Monterey had been oriented towards conference interpreting, and nobody knew anything about court interpreting. So I learned the hard way about the expectations of interpreting everything quasi verbatim for the record. And also I learned the local language of farm workers, which was nothing like the Spanish I had learned in school. So I was constantly challenged by attorneys. And as I was driving to every assignment, I was praying that people would not show up and the whole thing would be canceled, because I felt so awful about how badly I was doing. But I learned a lot, and fortunately, nobody else knew what they were doing either. This was in the mid-70s. Then California decided to come up with a certification program. So I was one of the first batch of people to take that test, which was appalling. They passed pretty much anybody who had a pulse. And I felt terrible after I took the test, but apparently I did well enough that they asked me to be an examiner the following year. So I got an inside look at how bad the test was, because for the simultaneous, it was administered live, and they would stop. If somebody got behind, they would just stop talking and let them catch up.
I bet you there are people here who are like, wow, we wish the test was like that now.
I wish I had that. Yeah, I mean, I always say that the only reason I got into this was the low standards. But anyway, I did pass that exam, and then the federal government decided to test interpreters. So I took that exam, not knowing what I was getting into.